Hello, and welcome to the Postcode Revolution podcast, talking the future on your doorstep. I'm Jack Cooper, founder and director of Postcode Revolution, an organisation focused on community building and emergency climate adaptation in the neighbourhoods we call home. This series explores the ideas of Postcode Revolution to change the world of business as usual. This week, we welcome Lauren Banham to the podcast. Lauren is co-founder and program director of the Legal Pact, an advocate for human and planetary rights, and a third-year international development student at the University of Sussex, which is where we met. Welcome to the podcast, Lauren.
Thanks so much for having me, Jack.
I'd like to first ask you about the organisation you co-founded, the Legal Pact.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been working in the advocacy space for about 5 years now. And through this work, I was invited to attend a conference in New York in March 2023. And at this conference, I met my now two co-founders of the organisation. And we all basically shared the same frustration that a lot of the time, especially in civil society surrounding the UN, we found that we were spending lots of resources, manpower, hours, financial resources, sitting around discussing things and kind of banging our fists on the table and saying this needs to change and making these declarations. But we all had this frustration, the three of us, that nothing that we were doing here is enforceable. These declarations made at the UN are incredibly important for political will, absolutely, there's no denying it. But there also needs to be a role for enforceable rights. And I think this is a massive part of the conversation that we all felt was really missing from all of the work we were doing. And we founded our organisation to focus specifically on promoting enforceable rights for people and nature and looking at the court systems surrounding them and how they could be enforced.
So you have experience of attending international conferences and working with high-level actors. How often is the local community level addressed in these high-powered environments, and do you think it could be more?
It absolutely could be and needs to be more. I am really grateful for the work of a lot of people who are really working hard to shift this. There is absolutely, even in my experience of the 5 years I've been doing this, a recognizable shift that I can see of local community context being recognized much, much more in this work, which is really great to see, but it absolutely doesn't go far enough. Because at the same time, there's this narrative being pushed that I experience a lot, and as much as possible, I work to push back against, which is this idea that because a lot of the issues that we face are big international issues, we need big international actors to tackle them. And while, of course, it's really important that we have these strong multilateral institutions to facilitate this change, this absolutely does not work without people on the ground being engaged in these issues. What the UN can do at the top and other international actors like this is important, but it absolutely has to be mirrored by people on the ground caring and implementing these things and acting with the knowledge of their local context and priorities. Decades of research has shown that it's local people who are able to understand their local context and what it is their local people need more than anyone else. I'm really grateful that I work with a couple of amazing organizations who push for this. Particularly, I work with an organization called UCLG, United Cities Local Governments, and they work really hard to ensure that at these big institutions, there is the voices of local governments represented. Now, of course, local government still isn't quite at that community level, but they are much better placed to be able to work with and represent the interests of local community. And specifically, we need to be pushing back against this narrative that because our issues are big, we need big actors to tackle them.
Related to that, do you think the COP process is fatally flawed?
So I would absolutely agree that the COP process is sort of fundamentally flawed. I attended COP26 in Glasgow, and for me, that was an experience where, to be completely honest, I came away with absolutely no hope that governments were doing anything back in COP26. They promised this world-leading climate education. That was one of the big things that Boris Johnson got up there and said the UK is going to provide world-leading climate education. And that's really lovely. And we were like, wouldn't that be nice? But I mean, I had absolutely no faith at the time that would manifest. And what do you know, it hasn't. So it's like people can come to COP and what is it? I think previously it's 80% of the delegates have been from from the oil industry, they
Mm.
can come together, they can say, we're going to do this, and then not do anything about it. And that for me is why it's so important that we focus on the side of this that is enforceable. Because while it's nice to sit around and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, in reality, these things often don't happen. They either don't turn out in the way that they were that we think they will, or they just don't turn out at all. Since then, I've not gone back to a COP. To be honest, I don't think I would unless there was significant reform to the way in which they work. And there was ways in which we are able to actually enforce the things that are agreed there.
I was also at COP26.
Yeah,
I was on the outside engaging in
nice.
um, more
You were on the right side then.
radical environmental action.
Yeah, yeah, good.
Yeah. And I haven't been to another COP. I'd like to ask you about your work as an advocate for human and planetary rights. What does that involve and mean to you?
So, we have a very anthropocentric view of rights. Our understanding of rights, particularly in the Western world, is basically kind of all centered around human rights. So for me, that looks like, being the voice of those who don't have a voice, whether that's those who aren't able to be in the room or nature itself. Trying as hard as I can to use my position in that to open up that conversation and to give voices to others. So not just saying I can speak on behalf of them, but also saying how is it we can bring people who actually have lived experience of this reality into these conversations. Obviously, that's not so easy with nature, but there are obviously communities who are much more connected with nature, and that's why in the past I've made a real effort to try and involve Indigenous communities in the work that I've been doing, or to try and involve those who are directly on the ground dealing with the environmental destruction that we are discussing in the work surrounding protecting those rights.
Historically, there's been a lot of Western pushback on Indigenous perspectives on nature as being something integral to all life and something that has a voice. And do you still find much skepticism about the aliveness and personhood of nature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not something that anyone is going to probably for their own, political or cancelable, if you want to say, motivations. They're not going to outwardly come out and say, this is not right, this is not true. But there are those subtle pushbacks against it. One example is that recently I did a lot of work on the UN Summit of the Future. And the outcome document for this was a pact for the future that was negotiated by the different states. Originally, in this document, there was going to be no mention of the environment whatsoever. And, this was absolutely ridiculous to loads of us working on this because we were like, how can you have a summit of the future and not discuss the environment, the very thing which is going to define the future that, the reality of the future that we live in? So this is something that a lot of NGOs and communities pushed back against, and eventually the pact did have lots of mention of the environment, lots of mention of the climate crisis. There are a lot of watering down of these ideas that come from Indigenous communities. There is a lot of watering down of them, so that it can be kind of more palatable and more reflective of the institutions that they're operating inside. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's explicit opposition to, but I would definitely say that there is kind of either a lack of understanding, a lack of will to implement it, or a conscious effort to kind of try and make these concepts fit comfortably within our understanding of nature in the Western world,
Yeah.
specifically nature as a resource, I would say.
And to extend this into space, do you think that the attitude towards the moon as a resource in some ways is reflective of this outlook, but in some ways it's less cancelable because it's so literally out of this world in thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say one of the reasons that from the beginning of our work with Legal Pact, we knew that we wanted our advocacy of rights for nature to be both nature on Earth and in space is because to us, it's incredibly obvious how exploitation of outer space or the potential exploitation of outer space and the increasing use and viewing of celestial bodies in space as a resource just completely mirrors our exploitation of Earth. I mean, you know, for centuries, we have had this understanding in the Western world of nature as a resource for us. And obviously, post-industrial revolution, this is something that's become central to our economies and to how we live as societies. We're now starting to see a shift in this. But the stuff that's happening in space, the increasing use of space as a resource, private, like the huge rapid expansion of private actors in space, a deep mining on the moon. All of these things, to me anyway, are reflective of our view of nature as something that we can basically mess around and find out with. And we've seen the absolutely devastating consequences of this on Earth. And in my mind, it makes absolutely no sense that we kind of, again, like sort of mess around and find out with the very thing that keeps us in orbit. I think we also have this idea that because space is so big and profound, and difficult to kind of wrap our heads around, that it must be incredibly powerful and, you know, just like absolute, and not have those same delicate ecosystems that we have on Earth, when this is absolutely not the case. I mean, space has its own delicate ecosystems that absolutely, if subject to human interference, could completely shift in the same way we've seen on Earth. So yeah, for me, this is incredibly reflective of that, and that's why we wanted to push for this, because I think it's something that people aren't really necessarily aware of, or they don't really realize the scale of the issue, because it's not something that people are necessarily very engaged in unless they already have skin in the game, if that makes sense. So for example, a lot of countries maybe don't see this as a legislative or diplomatic priority, but if they don't already have kind of the resources financially to be engaging in outer space activity, perhaps there's this idea that it's kind of, you know, not really our issue. When I think we need to really be aware of how the actions in outer space could have implications for all of us on Earth.
A challenge in the climate space and the space as well, I imagine, attempting to conceptualize systems which are so vast compared to our small human lives. It's a constant challenge, and I find that I can get too sucked into the micro, too sucked into the macro. How do you navigate that?
This is one of the reasons why I've become more involved in the organisations that I spoke about previously, particularly UCLG, because I was just experiencing this massive frustration with everything being done on a global scale. And especially having come from so for example, my parents are very engaged in the local community. My dad is the pastor of a local church. My mum works in mental health with the local community, but when I was growing up, she worked providing environmental education for the local schools. And so, you know, having come from that local background and now working at a level that I struggle to comprehend a lot of the time with these global actors, it's definitely a balance that I find myself grappling with, because I really see the power of the local communities, and I really see how much that's forgotten often at the global level. But that's definitely why I made a conscious decision to start working with these organizations, if not necessarily to kind of push their agenda forward, but mainly for my own kind of personal relief that there are people out there doing this work, fighting to ensure that communities are actually represented. So I think that it's definitely something that I struggle with balancing, but I think trying to kind of like bring that perspective that I started in, or that I kind of grew up understanding the world in this local community context from how I was raised, trying to bring that angle and that aspect to the work that I do gives me the ability to kind of always look back and say, like, you know, how can we bring in that community level? It's a constant fight, but it's also something that we need to be doing. And I think it's really actually just positively impacted my work. I can't think of a single time where I've fought to try and get that local perspective in where it's not actually strengthened the work that I've been doing.
Thank you for your time and all the amazing work.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really great conversation, and I think the work of Postcode Revolution is so important at the moment. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the podcast episodes.
Thank you. And thank you for listening. Bye, guys. This podcast was produced and edited by me, Jack Cooper, with music by Lisa Mira and Boomtown. Please rate and share the podcast if you enjoyed it, and if you'd like to support Postcode Revolution and dive deeper into these ideas, you can become a supporter for £5 a month on Patreon and access the extended cut of this conversation and all the others in the series. Thanks for listening. See you in 2 weeks.